Welcome, my fearless viewers, to a night of spine-chilling terror. Babysitting. It's supposed to be easy, right? Watch some kids, eat some snacks, and maybe binge a show. But for the unlucky souls in these tales, babysitting became their worst nightmare. Turn the lights down, lock your doors, and prepare yourself for 4 terrifying babysitting horror tales. Let's begin, if you dare. The Crying Doll. As Mia sat in the back of the taxi on her way to the mansion, she couldn't help but think about how odd the job offer had been. Mrs. Drayton had contacted her through a babysitting app, but there hadn't been much information on the profile. No reviews, no previous bookings. Desperate for cash, Mia had ignored her reservations. Rent was due, and freelance gigs had been sparse lately. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. The instructions had been unusually specific. Bring no one else, arrive on time, and don't question the house rules. Mrs. Drayton's final text had sealed the unease in Mia's chest. The house will not tolerate disobedience. What did that even mean? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Rich people had their quirks. Maybe Mrs. Drayton was just eccentric. The grand staircase seemed to stretch endlessly as Mia climbed to check on Ethan. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, but it didn't feel soothing. It felt cloying, like it was masking something. As she walked, she thought she heard faint whispers, but when she stopped to listen, there was only silence. The nursery door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the temperature was at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house, and her breath fogged slightly. Ethan slept peacefully, his tiny fist curled near his face. Mia couldn't help but glance at the shelves of dolls again. They weren't just toys, they were artifacts. Each one seemed to tell a story, and not a happy one. Some had cracks in their porcelain faces, and others had smudges on their cheeks that looked disturbingly like dried tears. The crying doll, larger than the rest, seemed to dominate the room, even from its corner. Its painted tears gleamed in the flickering light, and its mournful expression felt almost accusatory. "Who even makes dolls like that?" Mia muttered under her breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's glass eyes were following her as she moved. Panic surged through Mia as she frantically searched the room. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her gaze darted to the floor, where she saw him lying in the center of the room, surrounded by the dolls. They were arranged in a perfect circle, their tiny porcelain hands pointing toward him. The crying doll sat at the center of the circle, holding Ethan's blanket. Its head snapped up, and its glass eyes locked onto Mia's. "Run!" it hissed. Mia stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. The other dolls began to stir, their movements jerky and unnatural. One by one, they turned their heads toward her, their glass eyes reflecting the dim light. Tiny hands reached out, and the air was filled with the sound of porcelain scraping against wood. Mia lunged for Ethan, snatching him up just as the dolls began to crawl toward her. Their movements were grotesque, like insects scuttling across the floor. The crying doll stood, its movements disturbingly fluid. It raised one hand and pointed directly at Mia. "Leave," it commanded, its voice echoing unnaturally. Mia bolted for the door, clutching Ethan tightly. The dolls pursued her, their tiny feet pattering against the floor. She slammed the nursery door behind her, but the sound of scratching and banging continued. The crying doll's voice rang out, louder now. "Don't let them out." By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, Mia was on edge. The house felt alive. Its silence was no longer just quiet. It was oppressive. She kept glancing toward the staircase, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. The crying started again, faint and high-pitched. Mia froze, her phone slipping from her fingers onto the carpet. She held her breath, straining to hear. It was louder this time, more distinct, and it was coming from the nursery. Her legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs. Each step seemed louder than the last, echoing in the suffocating silence. The nursery door was ajar, and light spilled out into the hallway. The crying grew louder, piercing and desperate, and Mia felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The moment she stepped into the nursery, the crying stopped. The room was unnaturally dark now, and the flickering light cast long, sinister shadows. The rocking chair creaked, and Mia's stomach dropped. The crying doll was no longer on the floor. It was back in the rocking chair, but its position had changed. Its head was tilted to one side, and its hands were outstretched, as if reaching for something or someone. Mia's heart pounded as she turned to the crib. Ethan was gone. Mia didn't stop running until she was outside, the cool night air shocking her lungs. She didn't even realize she was barefoot until she reached the edge of the driveway, her feet stinging from the gravel. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a middle-aged man, helped her into the back seat. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Mia couldn't speak. She just clutched Ethan, her entire body trembling. The man drove her to the nearest police station, where she tried to explain what had happened. But how do you tell someone about living dolls without sounding insane? The officers were kind, but skeptical. They agreed to check the house, but when they arrived, it was empty. No family, no furniture, no dolls. Mia returned home in a daze, Ethan still asleep in her arms. She tried to piece together what had happened, but it didn't make sense. She quit babysitting that day, but the memories of the mansion haunted her. Weeks later, Mia received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single item, the crying doll. Its glass eyes seemed to glint with malice, and its painted tears looked fresh. She threw it away immediately, but the nightmares
And there you have
persisted.
it. 4 horrifying
Sometimes,
tales that remind
in the middle
us
of the night,
babysitting is far
she
more
swore
than just
she could
watching
hear
over
faint
kids.
sobbing coming
But
from
who
the corner
knows?
of her bedroom.
Maybe the next time
Other
you're left
times,
alone,
she'd wake
you'll hear
up to
the
find her
whispers
belongings
too.
moved.
Sleep well,
as
my
if
brave
someone
friends.
or
And remember,
something
not every house
had been in her room.
is safe.
Mia moved to a new
Subscribe
apartment,
for more
desperate for a
chilling
fresh start.
tales.
But the crying doll followed her. No matter where she went, it always found its way back. And every time it reappeared, its expression seemed to change. Its painted tears more pronounced, its glass eyes filled with something that looked disturbingly like rage. One night, unable to take it anymore, Mia decided to destroy the doll. She took it to an empty lot and doused it in gasoline. As the flames consumed it, she felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. But as she turned to leave, she heard it. The doll's laughter echoed in her mind, and Mia realized she could never escape. The crying doll wasn't just a toy, it was a curse, and now it was hers to bear. The Midnight Caller. Josh's phone buzzed with a new message as he stepped into the small, dimly lit library. It was a text from a family he had babysat for once before, asking for a last-minute sitter for their twin boys. He frowned, hesitating. Babysitting wasn't exactly his idea of a fun Friday night, but the rent was due, and his bank account wasn't looking great. Besides, he reasoned, it would be an easy gig. "I'll take it," he texted back, hoping that a few hours of mindless watching cartoons would be enough to cover the bills. When Josh arrived at the house, it immediately struck him as odd. The old Victorian-style home towered at the end of the street, its dark exterior seemingly untouched by time. The creaking wooden floors, heavy drapes, and the thick air inside gave the place an eerie vibe. Yet the parents seemed unbothered by the house's aged look. They had hurried instructions, barely waiting for him to process what they were saying. The twins are upstairs, in their room. Just keep an eye on them, and make sure they're in bed by 9, the mother said quickly. Her voice was tight, like she was late for something. Oh, and don't mind the old rotary phone in the hallway. It doesn't work, but it's been here for years. Josh nodded absently, still feeling unsettled by the house's atmosphere. Something didn't feel right, but he chalked it up to the late hour. The family left soon after, leaving Josh alone in the strangely quiet house. The night begins. The first hour passed without much to report. Josh wandered the house, finding the twins, Danny and Jake, playing quietly upstairs. They were unusually well behaved, hardly making a sound as they moved their toys around on the floor. Their eyes, however, were unnaturally wide, like they were expecting something to happen. He figured they were just tired and maybe a bit too attached to their toys. Trying to distract himself, Josh grabbed a snack and sat down on the couch, flipping through the channels. The house was old, with creaking wooden floors and dark corners. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound breaking the stillness. He could hear the twins laughing softly upstairs, but that was the extent of it. At least, for now. That was until the phone rang. Josh jumped, startled by the shrill sound. He had assumed the phone was a relic of the past, nothing more than a decorative piece. But there it was, ringing in the hallway, loud and insistent. Josh's heart raced as he stood up. He walked toward it slowly, hesitating for a second before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice sounding more uncertain than he wanted to admit. A faint, raspy voice crackled through the line. "Check the basement." Josh froze, his grip tightening on the receiver. His stomach churned. That didn't make sense. The basement was off limits. "Hello?" Josh asked again, his voice shaking. "Who is this?" The line went dead with a sharp click. The twins' warning. Josh stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, unsure of what to do. He glanced nervously toward the stairs, where the twins were still playing. He put the receiver down, trying to shake off the unease creeping over him. Probably just a prank, he muttered to himself. Still, as he made his way upstairs to check on the twins, the feeling that something was wrong lingered in the back of his mind. Danny and Jake were sitting together on the floor, their faces oddly serious. "What's wrong?" Josh asked, trying to sound reassuring. "We don't go down there," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, the man doesn't like visitors," Jake added, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Josh stared at them, unsure of how to respond. He figured it was just childish imagination or some game they'd made up. "The basement? There's nothing down there," Josh said with a chuckle, though his own words sounded hollow in the heavy air. But the boys didn't seem comforted. Instead, they only looked more frightened, as if they had said too much already. Josh ignored it, telling himself they were just trying to make the night more exciting. The phone rings. Again. Not long after, the phone rang again. This time, Josh's heart skipped a beat. He walked slowly toward it, feeling his anxiety rise. He picked up the receiver, holding it to his ear, already dreading what he might hear. "They're waiting," a voice growled, low and guttural. Josh felt a chill race down his spine. the words lingering in his mind like a bad omen. The lights in the hallway flickered, and for a brief second, the shadows on the walls seemed to shift unnaturally. Josh could feel his pulse quicken. Just as he was about to hang up, he heard a loud scream from the twins' room. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed upstairs to check on them. He threw open the door, only to find them huddled together on the bed, trembling. "The closet," Danny whispered. "It's open." Josh turned toward the closet, his stomach tightening. Sure enough, the door was ajar, and it was no longer filled with clothes. Instead, there were muddy footprints leading out into the hallway. The basement door. Josh's heart raced as he followed the trail of footprints. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew he had to get the boys out of there. He grabbed their hands and turned to leave the room when the basement door suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang. Josh's breath caught in his throat. The basement door was locked before. He had checked it earlier. He tried to open it, but the handle refused to turn. The phone rang again. His hand shook as he picked it up, the line crackling with static. "You can't leave now," the voice hissed, sending a wave of dread washing over him. Josh turned to the boys. "We have to go," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the basement door creaked open on its own. A dark figure stepped into view at the bottom of the stairs. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, and draped in shadows. Its face was hidden, but its glowing red eyes bore into Josh, sending a cold shiver down his spine. Josh grabbed the boys and pulled them toward the front door. His hands fumbled with the lock, his heart pounding, as the figure seemed to move closer, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Finally, the door flew open, and they bolted into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached the neighbor's house, gasping for breath and still shaking from the terror they had just escaped. The aftermath. The next day, Josh decided to call the family and explain what had happened. The father, however, sounded unusually calm. "We'll look into it," he said, his tone flat, as if he had heard it all before. "Thanks for your time." Josh, puzzled, pressed him for more information. The father quickly ended the call. When Josh passed the house a few days later, something seemed off. The windows were all boarded up, and the "for sale" sign was crooked, like it had been abandoned long ago. Danny and Jake never spoke of that night again. Josh didn't blame them, but every so often, when he was alone, he'd swear he could still hear the faint ringing of a rotary phone in the distance, and the voice whispering, "They're waiting."
The shadow in the window. Emily wasn't new to babysitting. As a college sophomore juggling bills and tuition, she had plenty of experience looking after kids in suburban neighborhoods. The gig tonight seemed simple. 2 children, Sophie and Max, already asleep upstairs, and a cozy home with a fully stocked fridge. The parents were warm and friendly, though a bit hurried. The father had muttered something about the security cameras on the house being quirky, but Emily didn't think much of it. "It's a quiet neighborhood," the mother reassured her. "Nothing ever happens around here." Emily smiled, nodding politely as the parents drove off. She didn't know it yet, but this would be the longest and most terrifying night of her life. The first encounter. By 9:30 p.m., Emily had settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, half watching a rerun of a sitcom while scrolling through her phone. The silence of the house was comforting at first, but as the minutes ticked by, it felt oppressive. She shrugged it off. The sound of crickets outside reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. Then movement caught her eye. At the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard, a dark silhouette stood motionless. Emily froze, her heart thudding. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its shape illuminated faintly by the glow of the moonlight. She squinted, trying to make out any features, but it was too dark. Mustering her courage, she got up and approached the door, flipping on the backyard lights. The yard was empty. The figure had vanished. Emily's pulse slowed. It was probably just a shadow cast by a tree or a neighbor walking past a fence. She locked the sliding door just in case and returned to the couch, telling herself she was overreacting. But a nagging feeling of unease crept in. She glanced at the clock. 10 p.m. Only a few more hours until the parents returned. The second encounter. The house was quiet again, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Emily was about to switch off the TV when she saw it. In the living room window, directly across from her, the same shadow stood. This time, it felt closer, more menacing. Her stomach tightened as she stared at it, willing herself to believe it was some kind of optical illusion. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. Someone was outside. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and called the parents. The mother answered quickly, her voice calm but tired. "There's someone outside," Emily whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. The mother sighed. "It's probably just the neighbors. This area is really safe, I promise. Keep the doors locked and let us know if anything happens." Emily hung up, her unease growing. She checked all the locks again, making sure every door and window was secure. As she turned to head back to the living room, she froze. The shadow was gone. The children's screams. Emily's thoughts raced as she sat on the couch, gripping her phone tightly. Every small noise made her jump. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock. She tried to focus on her breathing, telling herself it was just her imagination. Then, a piercing scream shattered the silence. She bolted upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from Sophie and Max's room. Throwing the door open, she found the children huddled under the bed, their wide eyes filled with terror. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. Max pointed a trembling finger at the closet. "The shadow man," he whispered. "He's in there." Emily's stomach dropped. She glanced at the closet door, which was slightly ajar. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward and yanked it open. The closet was empty. Still, the children refused to come out from under the bed. Emily's instincts screamed at her to get them out of the house. She scooped up Sophie in one arm and held Max's hand with the other, rushing them downstairs. The final encounter. Outside, the cool night air felt like a relief, but Emily's panic hadn't subsided. She unlocked the car and helped the children into the back seat, locking the doors behind them. As she started to pull away, something compelled her to look back at the house. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadow was no longer outside. It was inside, standing at the second floor window. It didn't move, didn't wave. It just watched. The figure seemed darker now, almost blending into the shadows of the room, but its presence was undeniable. Emily sped off, not daring to look back again. The police investigation. The parents returned shortly after Emily called them, apologizing profusely for her distress. The police were called, and an officer arrived to search the house. They found no signs of forced entry, no footprints outside, and nothing unusual inside. Emily described the figure, her voice trembling. The officer listened patiently, but offered little comfort. "Could have been a prank," he suggested. "Kids in the area sometimes mess around," but Emily knew what she saw. This wasn't a prank. As the officer left, Emily joined the parents in the living room to discuss what had happened. Her eyes wandered to the family photos on the wall. At first, she wasn't paying attention, but then something made her stop. Her stomach flipped. In every picture, there was something wrong. A dark shape lingered in the background, faint but unmistakable. The shadow. It was there at birthday parties, standing behind the family at the dinner table, even in photos of the children playing in the yard. Emily's blood ran cold as her gaze moved to the last photo, the family standing in front of the house. The shadow was at the window, watching. Aftermath. Emily quit babysitting after that night. No amount of money could convince her to step foot in another unfamiliar house. Sophie and Max's parents moved away a few months later. The house was eventually abandoned, its windows boarded up. Sometimes, late at night, Emily would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced she could see a shadow in the corner of her room. She always told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. The shadow wasn't bound to that house, and once it had seen her, it wasn't going to let her forget.
The Whispering Walls.
Sarah wasn't thrilled about babysitting that evening. The historic Ashford Manor, located on the outskirts of town, loomed in isolation. The house had been standing for over a century, and its Victorian architecture was impressive but unsettling. Stories about the manor had circulated for years, from its eccentric original owners to mysterious disappearances. But Sarah brushed off such talk as small-town gossip. Ghost stories were for campfires, not real life. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harding, seemed pleasant enough. They left detailed instructions, reassured her that their children, Lila, age 8, and Max, age 6, were well-behaved and promised to return by midnight. The moment the door shut behind them, however, Lila whispered, "Have you heard about the whispers?" "What whispers?" Sarah asked, half smiling. "They come from the walls," Lila said matter-of-factly. "Only at night." Max added in a hushed tone, "It's the ghosts. They get mad if you don't listen." Sarah laughed nervously. "Well, I guess I better listen closely then." She dismissed it as kids trying to spook her and shifted the conversation to dinner and games. As the night wore on, the children seemed on edge. Lila kept glancing at the walls, and Max refused to go upstairs alone. Sarah played along, pretending to be brave, but a chill crept into her chest when the grandfather clock in the hall struck 9. The sound echoed through the house like a tolling bell. After putting the kids to bed, Sarah settled on the couch with her phone. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was probably just the house settling, she told herself, though the sound had an odd rhythm, almost like footsteps. And then she heard it, the faintest of whispers. At first, she thought it might be the kids talking, but the sound wasn't coming from their rooms. It was coming from the walls. "Just the plumbing," she muttered, though her voice wavered. She leaned closer to the floral wallpaper, pressing her ear against the surface. The whispers stopped. She exhaled, laughing at her own paranoia, and stepped away. But the moment she turned, she heard it again, this time louder. The words were just barely distinguishable. "Get out." Sarah's chest tightened. She stood frozen, her eyes darting toward the hallway. The whispers seemed to be following her now, growing louder with each passing second. "Lila? Max!" she called, forcing her voice to remain steady. No response. She hurried upstairs to check on the kids. Both were fast asleep, their soft breath steady and calm. The whispers stopped the moment she entered their rooms, but the silence was even more unsettling. She thought about calling the Hardings, but what could she say? "Hey, I think your house might be haunted. Could you come home early?" Trying to shake off her nerves, she returned to the living room. But as she reached the bottom of the staircase, she noticed something strange. The ornate wallpaper near the front door had started to peel, as if something was pushing from underneath. Heart pounding, Sarah stepped closer. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the wallpaper. She hesitated, but finally gave it a small tug. A strip of paper came loose, revealing deep gouges in the wood beneath, claw marks, jagged and uneven. "What the?" she whispered, stepping back. Before she could think, the whispers returned, now urgent and angry. "Get out! Get out!" The lights flickered violently, and a deafening scream erupted from the walls, so loud that Sarah clapped her hands over her ears. The chandelier above her swayed, its crystals clinking like wind chimes in a storm. The front door rattled as if someone, or something, was trying to force it open. She ran to the door, gripping the handle with trembling hands, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled or twisted, it stayed locked. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to call the Hardings, but the screen flickered and went black. A cold wind whipped through the room, though every window was shut. Sarah spun around, her breath visible in the frigid air. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a shadow slipping along the wall, like ink spreading across paper. Her knees buckled as a figure emerged from the wall, stepping through it as though it were made of water. The figure was tall and grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face, or what should have been a face, was hollow and distorted, like melted wax. The whispers turned into guttural groans as the shadowed figure reached for her. Its fingers, twisted and clawed, scraped against the hardwood floor, leaving deep grooves. "Sarah!" Lila's voice pierced through the chaos. Sarah turned to see the two children standing at the top of the staircase, their faces pale with terror. "Stay there!" Sarah shouted, though her voice cracked. She grabbed the closest thing she could find, a decorative vase, and hurled it at the figure. It shattered on impact, but the entity didn't flinch. Instead, it turned its hollow gaze toward the children. "No!" Sarah screamed, sprinting toward the stairs. She grabbed the kids, holding them close as the figure advanced. "Make it stop!" Max cried, tears streaming down his face. Desperate, Sarah remembered the ornate mirror hanging in the hallway. There had been a story her grandmother once told her about spirits being trapped in reflections. It was a long shot, but she had no other plan. "Come on!" she yelled, dragging the children with her. The shadow followed, its distorted body bending and contorting as it moved. Sarah snatched the mirror off the wall and turned to face the entity. The figure recoiled slightly as its reflection appeared. Without thinking, Sarah smashed the mirror on the ground, shards scattering across the floor like ice. The entity let out a bone-chilling scream, its form flickering like a dying flame. It lunged one last time before dissolving into a thick black mist which seeped back into the walls. The house fell silent. The light stopped flickering and the air grew warm again. Sarah, clutching the children, stared at the walls, half expecting the shadow to return. When the Hardings arrived home, Sarah was still sitting on the couch, holding a sleeping Lila and Max in her arms. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow with shock. "Sarah, are you all right?" Mrs. Harding asked, concern etched across her face. "What is wrong with this house?" Sarah demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The Hardings exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Mr. Harding sighed. "We didn't want to scare you, but something terrible happened here years ago. A babysitter disappeared one night, without a trace. The only clue was claw marks on the walls and whispers. People say her spirit is still here." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We thought it was just old rumors," Mrs. Harding said. "No one's had any issues before. We didn't think." "Think what?" "That it would happen again." Sarah snapped. "I'm not staying another minute." The Hardings apologized profusely, but Sarah didn't care. She packed her things and left, refusing to look back at the house. As she drove away, she could still hear the whispers faintly in her ears. The next morning, Sarah received a call from the Hardings. They sounded shaken. The wallpaper in the living room, Mrs. Harding said, her voice trembling. It peeled back, and we found something carved into the wood. What? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. There was a long pause before Mrs. Harding answered. Help me. That wraps up tonight's spine-chilling tales. Let this be your reminder that some jobs come with risks you never imagined. Now, if you enjoyed being thoroughly creeped out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss another story. Drop a comment below about the scariest moment from this video, or better yet, share your own eerie experiences. Who knows? Your story could be featured in an upcoming episode. Stay safe, stay curious, and as always, keep the lights on